So today we start on the practice of the mean, which is actually the third text in the 4 books of Confucian learning in Chinese called Zhongyong. Now, before I begin on the actual text, I'd like to first cover issues of the authorship, transmission, and the actual structure. So according to the traditional view, the Sima Qian wrote in the records of the historian, the Shiji, that the practice of the mean was authored by Zisi when he faced difficulties in the state of Song. And this was a view upheld by Zhu Xi. So we know, of course, that Zhu Xi's 4 books and his commentaries became the core curriculum for the last 600 years of Imperial China in terms of the civil service examinations. So this view of the authorship of the practice of the mean is very much the mainstream pre-modern Chinese view. So who is Zisi? Well, Zisi was the grandson of Confucius. He was taught by the prominent student Zengzi. And much like his grandfather, he was known as an authority and expert on rituals, the rites of the times. And so much so that in the received text of the records of ritual, the Li Ji, 4 of the chapters, including the practice of the mean, is attributed to Zisi. Now, during his time, he was very much respected by the state leader of Lu, Duke Mu of Lu. But unfortunately, like his grandfather, he was relegated to the political sidelines and never achieved high political office, which I guess becomes a recurring theme in the writings that are attributed to him. According to Sima Qian as well, one of his students then goes on to teach Mencius, which then gives rise to this idea of, which then gives rise to the idea of the Zisi and Mencius lineage. So that's very interesting, of course, because then Zisi forms a very key link between Confucius and Mencius. And of course, when we later study the Mencius, you'll see that the philosophy of Mencius very much develops early Confucian thought. Now, scholars who've actually compared the practice of the mean and the Mencius have noted that there are similar themes. For example, the idea of sincerity, or in Chinese, cheng, human nature, and the heaven or ultimate reality. Now, this occurs in both the practice of the mean and the Mencius, but interestingly, not in the Analects. So that's why there's this thought of the Zisi and Mencius lineage. Now, modern scholars, however, predominantly hold the view that prior to the Han Dynasty, of which these artifacts came from, so prior to around the 2nd century BCE, writings were derived from an oral tradition. Now, what this means is that the philosophy, these ideas, were handed down by word of mouth, and then different people recorded them. So it's very difficult then to pinpoint who was the author, because the author in the modern sense of the person who put, pen to paper, or in the olden days, brush to bamboo, is not very clear in pre-Han times. So what's very likely then is that this was an oral tradition, different people recorded it, and then when it was compiled, a representative historical figure was then was attributed to this historical figure. So in the case of the practice of the mean, it was attributed to Confucius's grandson, Zisi. And when we read the text, of course, you'll also see that, parts of the text have different styles and possibly even different ideas, which has led scholars to think that it is a composite document, which means that the text includes different layers, sort of parts from different ages. So much so that some even say that there are parts that seem to be composed after the Warring States period, so after Zisi was alive, possibly in the Western Han period or even the later Han period. So it's important, of course, that we understand that there are these different views about authorship, but that certainly doesn't detract from the philosophy in the text, nor does it detract from the significance of the text itself. And I like to use the words of American sinologist Paul Golden here, who says that, he makes this comparison with the Bible. Well, it's widely accepted that the Bible is a composite document. But there's also no doubt that the Bible is one of the most significant texts in the Western civilization. So yes, we need to know about the textual history, but we can still very much learn from the philosophy in this text and read the text as it is. So that's just about the authorship and different ideas. Now we turn to the transmission of the text. So after it was compiled, the practice of the mean was selected and included as one of the chapters in the records of ritual, the Li Ji. And the earliest commentary that we have is from Zheng Xuan, who divides it into 33 sections. But during this time in the Han Dynasty, it was also considered to be quite significant, so much so that it was circulated individually. And this is recorded in the texts, the Qi Li and the Han Shu. Now, by the 11th century, it becomes even more prominent because the Emperor Renzong of the Song dynasty, he actually personally copied out the practice of the mean by hand and gave it as a gift to one of his senior ministers. And also for decades later, he actually gave this text as a gift to candidates who successfully passed the metropolitan exams. So you can see, of course, the value of this text as a standalone text outside the records of ritual. And then we have the very famous story about Zhang Zai, who's the Song dynasty philosopher. So from a very young age, Zhang Zai always wanted to join the army. Now, come the age of 20, he decides to enlist under the service of the very renowned statesman and army commander Fan Zhongyan. And in those days, you had to write a letter of introduction. So when Fan Zhongyan receives the letter from Zhang Zai, he immediately realizes this person is quite exceptional. Not only does he have this literary talent, but also the way he chooses his words shows that he's a young man of fine character. So when Fan Zhongyan and Zhang Zai finally meet, he actually persuades him not to join the army. He persuades him to go home and study the Confucian teachings. And he gives Zhang Zai one text, one book. As you can guess, it was the practice of the mean. And the rest is history. So Zhang Zai, after becoming having thoroughly mastered the practice of the mean, then goes on to become a very important philosopher of the times, honored as one of the founders of Neo-Confucianism. And to this day, we still study and research his works and his philosophy. So this is the impact of the practice of the mean on Zhang Zai. Now, as we know, Zhu Xi then selects the practice of the mean as part of his 4 books and becomes read by every literate person in China for the last 600 years of Imperial China. So the practice of the mean throughout Chinese history has been very important. Now, we turn to the structure of the text. So we can think of it as basically divided into 5 parts. And the sections that I've written here are based on Zheng Xuan's commentary. So the first part is a basic statement, which we'll discuss shortly. Second part involves quotations from Confucius about the practice of the mean. The third part is, really an extended response from Confucius in relation to Duke Ai of the State of Lu, his question on government. The fourth part is really what the practice of the mean is famous for, this idea of Confucian metaphysics. And it talks about this idea of sincerity or cheng. And finally, concluding sections, which really are a series of quotes from the Book of Odes. Now, as you can see, it's very different from the tightly sort of structured, very logical outline of the highest learning, which sort of proceeds from a micro to a macro kind of level of understanding. But at the same time, it's more internally coherent than something like the Analects, which presents more as sort of individual passages or quotes from Confucius. So this is a very different text in a way. But as you can see, it has similar ideas and thoughts. Now, the title of the text is this in Chinese, 中庸. And what it means, well, basically, this concept is found in the Analects. Here, Confucius says that the virtue of the practice of the Ming, 中庸, is the utmost, and yet it is not commonly found among the people anymore. So, even in Confucius's times, it was considered to be very exceptional, but also challenging. And we'll get into that later. Now, rather than talk about the meaning of the title right now, what I'd like to do first is to discuss and explain the opening passage, because it really covers a lot of the Confucian philosophical concepts. And then we will come back to this title, because the title is essentially a distillation of these concepts. So we'll return to the title. Now, the translation that I use on the slides will be based on the translation by Ian Johnston and Wang Ping, but I will provide my own modifications, and you'll see that it's quite substantially different. So without further ado, let's talk about the opening passage. And it begins with 3 major claims. So let's read them together. It says, what heaven imparts is called the nature. To follow the nature is called the way. Cultivating the way is called education. Now, these are very direct statements. In a way, they're definitions. Defines what's nature, what's the way, what's education. But first, let's talk about this idea of heaven. It's not related to the Christian heaven, nor is it sort of discussing, the skies above. Heaven actually refers to a Chinese philosophical concept known as the ultimate reality. So, as the name suggests, the ultimate reality is the most fundamental, the absolute nature, underlying nature of all things. Now, this sounds very abstract. Let's use an example. Let's think about the human body. So the human body is made up of different organ systems. And on the left here, I've provided a diagram of the digestive system. So as you can see, it's made out of different organs. One of these is called the liver. So body systems are made out of organs. And I've put a diagram or a picture of the organ, the liver here. Organs are then made out of tissues. So here is a sort of magnification of part of the liver. You can see the liver tissue. And then tissues are made up of cells. So here on the bottom right, all of these round circles are actually cells. And cells are considered the basic unit of life. But if we break down the cell, what do we get? We get molecules. Molecules are made up of atoms. And For a long time in human history, people thought that the atom was the smallest unit of matter until they broke open the atom and they realized that there were protons, neutrons, electrons, and even these are made up of elementary particles on the right here. Now, if we break down these elementary particles, what do you get? You get energy. So at the end of the day, we are masses of energy. And these are all established scientific facts. Now, the question I want to ask you is, where does this energy come from? And this question is a question related to metaphysics, or more specifically, a branch of metaphysics called ontology, which deals with this idea of how we come into being. Where does this energy come from such that we achieve this human state? So this is just in relation to the human body, to us. But what about the things around us, like the computer, the table, the chair? Well, if we break down all of these to the smallest particles, will be atoms, protons, subatomic particles, elementary particles, and then the same thing, ultimately energy. And so really, you can see that everything is made up of fundamentally this energy. And that's why it's very easy to understand how Neo-Confucians advocated what's called an ontological monism. Ontological being related to being, monism, mono meaning one. This idea, this philosophical idea that everything is made up of the same underlying substance or essence. Now, that's why Chinese philosophy talks about a lack of duality. So there's no duality between mind and body in Chinese philosophy. There's a unity, in fact, between mind and body. There's a unity between self and others, between self and all other living creatures, and even the environment. And what I mean by this unity is not physical closeness or unity, but rather united underlying substance, because we're the same. We're the fundamental underlying substance is the same, which is this ultimate reality. So if we get back to this first sentence, it tells us that this heaven or ultimate reality imparts to humans our innate nature. Then the question you would ask is, well, how are we related to this ultimate reality? Are we subordinate or secondary to this almighty creator? Chinese philosophy would answer no. In fact, Chinese philosophy tells us that humans are equal to heaven, equal to this ultimate reality, because we have the same. Fundamentally, we are this ultimate reality. And that we can see that from the very character in Chinese of Tian, or heaven. So heaven is made up of two parts, the bottom, which is the character for great, and a stroke at the top, which means one. Now, this character for great we actually encountered in the highest learning. You can see that it resembles a person, stick figure of a person standing front on with their arms and their legs outstretched. But you're probably thinking, why does it represent big or great? And actually the person looks quite skinny. Well, it's not about the physical size. It's actually about this innate potential that we all have for moral greatness. So this innate moral greatness. And this greatness is no less than heaven and earth. Heaven and earth, which shelters and accommodates all beings without discrimination. So we have the same. And you can see that this particular one on top actually really points to the highest point of the human body, but it's also telling us that when humans achieve their highest potential, when we attain the highest learning, we too will achieve this same greatness as heaven and earth. But this first sentence tells us, really, that we have this capacity to be, to care, to serve, to love all beings, no less than heaven and earth, which nurtures and nourishes all things. And you can see that from this particular character of heaven. And yes, this reminds us very much of the highest learning, that we all have this innate potential, this enlightened virtue that we simply have to realize and unlock within us. So why is it then that this ultimate reality or this innate nature is so important? It's because it gives rise to everything. And if we can understand that, then we can unlock not only the mysteries of ourselves, but also of all things. So this relates to the function of this nature. So that's the next sentence. To follow the nature, our innate nature, but also the ultimate reality, is called the good life or the way. Now, this good life is not a subjective, is not something subjective, so it's not related to personal taste. It's grounded in the innate nature and the ultimate reality. So this way or the good life is when everything is flourishing. We achieve our highest potential, others do too. Everything, the environment is living in harmony. And that's called the way. There's this underlying sort of cosmic order, and you could call it the proper workings of the world is called the way. Now, how is the way in relation to humans? Because that's what we want to know, isn't it? How does it relate to human living such that we can live fulfilling lives? Well, the way of humanity is manifest or exemplified in 5 innate qualities. So this includes humanity, which is the sense of compassion, rightness, doing what's right, but also a sense of shame when we do something wrong and dishonorable. Ritual propriety, which is a sense of respect. Wisdom, which is sort of sound judgment and reasoning, distinguishing between right and wrong. And trustworthiness is doing as we say. So these 5 qualities, they sound quite abstract, but actually they are manifested in everything that we do and in all our interpersonal relationships. And Confucians boiled down all of the relationships in our life into 5 fundamental relations. They are sovereign and subject, but in modern terms, between the manager and the team member, or your leader and your team member, parent and child, between partners, between siblings and friends. So all of us, regardless of where we're born or when we're born, will have at least one of these relationships. We will have at least the parent and child relation. Now, how we relate, how we use these 5 qualities within these relationships helps us develop and leads us back to the way, developing our innate dispositions. So realizing the way for humanity is none other than through our interpersonal relationships and our daily activities. But you might say, well, do we really have these virtues? Because at times people can be quite self-centered. And this leads us to the 3rd claim in this opening sentence. Cultivating the way is called education. So the way is the way it should be. It's the ideal, proper workings of the world. But we need to cultivate it. We need to bring it to reality and experience it in our lives, cultivating our thoughts, words, and actions. In other words, we need to realize it. What's stopping us from realizing it? Well, when we cultivate, we can follow certain guidelines. For example, in the Dizugui, There's a particular guideline here, which is very useful for our self-cultivation. It states, if we correct our faults and our mistakes and do not repeat them, then they will cease. But if we try to cover them up, we will be doubly wrong. Well, it's telling us that we have to correct our faults and not cover up our faults. Now, what's stopping us from doing this? Why do we find it hard to do this? Well, it's because we think of our own interests and our own self-image more than the feelings of others. Sometimes we make mistakes and we don't even realize it. We don't want to admit it. And that's because, again, of our self-centeredness. So we have to cultivate ourselves. We have to change the way that we think. And that is what's called education from the Confucian perspective. Cultivating ourselves so that we are in accordance with this way, with the innate moral qualities that we have, and then we can recover our innate nature. And this idea of education is, of course, no surprise to us because we talked about it in the highest learning. We said that the highest learning was really about realizing our enlightened virtue, the greatness that we all have inside. So education, of course, involves learning and teaching. So learning, just like right now, when we're all learning together about the practice of the mean. But what's important is also our practice. So that's when we try to apply this in our daily life. When we practice, we actually provide an example for others, and that in itself is teaching. So we don't necessarily have to stand in front of a classroom. Just by applying these guidelines, these principles in our daily life, that is in itself teaching. And some commentaries tell us that the sages, the ancient sages, those who have already sort of realized their innate nature, they continued to cultivate the way. They continued to learn and practice it. And it's their example that then forms this Confucian education, forms the Confucian teachings. If we are able to use the teachings as guidelines, it helps us cultivate. It helps us then follow the nature and recover the ultimate reality, the way. So that, in very briefly, in a nutshell, is the first few lines of the practice of the mean. And as you can see, the very key philosophical concepts are already explained. So heaven, nature, the way, and education. And that's what the rest of the text will explore. Now, in the rest of the opening passage, at least, we will explore and elaborate more about the way. So not only how it relates to us, but how it relates to time and space in terms of where is the way. So that's the next line. It states here, the way cannot be departed from, even for an instant. If it can be departed from, it is not the way. It sounds like a paradox, doesn't it? Cannot be departed or it can be departed. There's actually a very good analogy that will help get our head around this. It's in relation to the sun and the earth. Does the sun ever leave the radiance? Does the earth ever leave the radiance of the sun? It's a bit of a trick question, but the answer is no. The sun is always there. It's always illuminating and producing energy. And it's only because the earth spins around on its axis that we have night and day. So for about 10 hours of the day, we don't actually see the sun. But that doesn't mean that the sun isn't there. It's only because of where we are on this earth and our own perspective that we don't see it. And that's a really great analogy for the way. So it can't be departed from, just like the sun. And if we think we can't see the sun, it's only because of our own perspective and where we are. Now, there's another example that's used, and that is if we were to walk out on a sunny day and hold up an umbrella, then we wouldn't be able to see the sun, right? But that doesn't mean that it's not there. It's only because of what we're doing. So, this word departed is actually quite misleading because it's not physically leaving somewhere or being apart from something. It's just something in terms of our mental activity. And there's a very good phrase in English which sort of conveys this idea. It's to go off track. So, when we're talking, and so for example, I'm talking to you now about practice of the mean, but if I suddenly talk to you about my holiday, then I've gone off track. It means that I'm no longer focused on this particular subject, but I'm distracted now. I'm talking about my holiday. So gone off track is the same idea as this departed. It's being distracted. The way is always there, but we're just not focused on it all the time. So we're distracted by other things. And because of that, we so-called depart from the way. Now, if it can be departed from, then it's really our distractions and it's not the way. So the way is always there. But you might be asking me, well, if it's always there, why can't I see it? And where is it? Well, the way is actually in our everyday activities and our interactions, as we mentioned before. So if a parent really, unconditionally loves their child, takes care of their child through this virtue of compassion, that in that moment is the way. If a child, whether they're grown up or whether they're young, they truly think about their feelings of their parents and they really care about their parents, in Chinese known as xiao or family reverence, in that thought is the way, and so on and so forth in our different roles and responsibilities. So as you can see, that despite the different roles that we have in our life, in each of them, there's actually a certain attitude or conduct that means that then we're able to tap into the way and then ultimately our innate nature. In fact, there's an underlying principle here throughout all of these different roles. And I wonder if you can see it. What's this underlying concept? Well, it's this oneness, isn't it? It's this idea of seeing others as oneself. And it's not only just other people, it's caring for all creatures as well. If we are able to use benevolence, you're able to care for other creatures, the environment, then this is also the way. So the way is simply that feeling, that thought, that attitude. And it reminds me of this character for benevolence, right? We've spoken about it before, or humanity. It's made up of two parts, human or ourselves on the left, and two or others on the right. So when we think of ourselves, we think of all others. And this is the idea of humanity. So we see ourselves, we see others as ourselves ultimately, and that is benevolence or humanity. So, for example, parents will give up sleep, change dirty nappies, and they don't take issue with that because they see this child as themselves. So this idea of the way is not in a particular person, like a parent or a child or a friend, but it's actually in our thought at that moment, in our attitude of oneness with others. So it doesn't matter what we're looking at, what we're doing, as long as we have the right attitude, then we are cultivating the way. And that is the focus that we have to have. Departing then is not really leaving. It's just getting distracted from this oneness and not acting or thinking about others as we should. Now, we talked about this in the highest learning, that, why is it that we see ourselves and not this oneness with others? And I guess that's the answer, isn't it? That we're always thinking about ourselves, this I, me, mine. And what we need to do when we cultivate the way is really to turn around our perspective, to refocus our perspective, so that we don't just look at ourselves, our things, but actually to then see the feelings of others and their concerns. And, we talked about this in the highest learning. Manifesting enlightened virtue is, that virtue that is always there, but we simply need to identify our thoughts that are arising. We need to evaluate them. Are they for ourselves or for others? And then when we let go of that selfishness, then we can truly help others. We can truly love the people. So the idea of the way being departed, well, it's not really departed at all. It's simply because of our minds. Being departed is when we're distracted. And we need to just come back to the way, because it's always there, like our enlightened virtue. We just need to refocus our minds. So this is in relation to time. So the way is always there, regardless of, each moment. There's no instant where it's not there. The next part covers time and space. So as it says here, this is why the exemplary person is on guard and cautious where they are not seen, fearful and apprehensive where they are not heard. There is nothing more apparent than what is hidden. There is nothing more manifest than what is obscure, and therefore the exemplary person is cautious when alone. So as it says here, cautious when alone, I've highlighted it because we discussed this in the highest learning as well. It's a very important starting point. Being alone is a very high risk period because, we think that we can do whatever we want. And that's why the exemplary person is even more vigilant than when they're with others. It says that they're fearful and apprehensive. What are they fearful and apprehensive about? That's the next sentence. They're fearful about what's hidden and what's obscure. Now, that's not related to themselves, being alone. It's actually their thoughts. And this reminds me of that passage in the highest learning when we said that what's sincere within is very manifest without. So these thoughts that we have, these feelings, these attitudes are actually very obvious to others. And it says that this analogy, that wealth is very apparent because, when people come to our house, they see very decadent furnishings. And similarly, if we have virtue, then it's very obvious to others in the way we speak, act, and how we care for others. So this is why the exemplary person particularly is vigilant over their thoughts, and they try to make their intentions sincere. And, when we return to the practice of the mean, it's telling us the same thing, that the exemplary person is always cautious when they're alone. Now, cautious of when they're alone is the spirit of this is not when they're physically alone, but it's what they alone know, according to Zhu Xi. And really that's their thoughts. They have to make their thoughts sincere. Ultimately we can't hide from others, what we're thinking because it's quite obvious, but even we can't hide from our own conscience. So this idea of being cautious when alone is being cautious of our thoughts. Now this is actually the first interpretation by Jun Xuan and also Zhu Xi, but there's also a second interpretation that I'd like to share with you. And when we look at this original interpretation on the right-hand side, I've put in red the fact that it says, the idea they're cautious about where they're not seen and where they are not heard. But another interpretation is that when what is not seen or what is not heard. So it's not about them anymore. They're actually cautious and concerned about the nature, their innate nature. And that is what's not seen or heard because the innate nature is formless. It can't be sensed. But it gives rise to everything, and that is the way. So here it says it's hidden, it's obscure, but it's also present and manifest. And that's the manifestations of the innate nature, which is the way. So the innate nature is manifested everywhere, in everything. And therefore, the exemplary person is ever concerned of this oneness, this idea of cultivating the way, and this idea of education. So I really like the second interpretation because, for three main reasons. The first is that the parts of the sentence really then relate to what we've talked about, this idea of nature, the way, and education, the very first lines of the text. The second reason is because it talks about being concerned rather than being fearful. Because, who wants to be fearful? Everyone wants to be happy and healthy. No one wants to be scared. And so the exemplary person is not fearful, but really more concerned or mindful and attentive to their innate nature because they really treasure it. They know about it. They really want to realize it, recover it. And that's why they are very attentive to it in every moment. They realize that it's in everything, in every interaction. And therefore, they want to cultivate it and make sure that they see this oneness. And so it talks about being concerned rather than being fearful. And finally, the third reason why I like it is because it talks about oneness and this idea of, seeing that unity, that underlying, that thought of care and concern for others through oneness. But having said that, both interpretations are actually equally valid. The original interpretation provides us, ultimately with a starting point, because if we want to apply the highest learning and the practice of the mean, we can first ask ourselves, what do I do when I'm alone? Do I do things that are sincere, accord with my conscience? This is a very good starting point for us. And in the sense that, we should always try to be attentive to this way and these innate qualities. So both interpretations equally valid. I leave it to you as to how you might want to understand this. But as you can see here, earlier we talked about time, and here we talk about space. The way is in everything and everywhere, and in every moment. Now, the next part of the text tells us about how the way is related to our inner world and the outer world. So let's take a look. It says, when joy, anger, sorrow, and happiness have not yet arisen, this is called the center. When they have arisen but are all regulated, this is called harmony. So according to Chinese philosophy, our emotions, our thoughts, this moral self, this, we could say the mental self, as well as the physical self, are actually both arise from the innate nature. But how do our emotions relate to the nature? Well, we could use the analogy of waves to the ocean. So the waves on the surface of an ocean. So the waves can be thought of as the emotions, and the ocean water can be thought of as our innate nature. So I don't know if you've ever been out in the open ocean before, but on a really good day, the water, it's very calm. There's almost no waves. It's very subdued, like the photo on the bottom here. But if there's a storm, there's strong winds, then there's going to be high waves, like the photo on the top here. And so the waves represent our emotions, and the wind represents these internal and external triggers for our emotions. So, externally, we can all understand, when we have disagreements with someone, triggers emotions, but also internally, when we have thoughts, when we're by ourselves, we can still, think of happy moments and laugh to ourselves, or think of someone who's passed away and feel very sad. So there are also internal triggers to these emotions, and these emotions are important because they actually cloud or obscure the equilibrium in our minds, and stops us from realizing the way or our innate nature. And that's the same for both negative and positive emotions. So here it's listed, joy and happiness also affect us. So you might ask, well, what's the difference between joy and happiness? Well, joy is more internally derived. Happiness is sort of derived from external stimuli. And so whether it's positive or negative emotions, both will affect our equilibrium. They affect our mind. And that's why it says here that we need to regulate them. We need to cultivate them. So regulating them is just another word for cultivation. And cultivating them gives rise to harmony. So there's an inner harmony and an outer harmony. We'll talk about the inner harmony first. So cultivating our emotions takes us back to what we talked about in the highest learning. We realize that these emotions actually come from the mind. And, our mind is determined by our intentions, which then are ultimately determined by our thoughts. So what we need to do is then evaluate these thoughts and perfect our knowledge. Make sure that these are thoughts for others rather than over and above ourselves. And if we can do that, our intentions will be sincere, and the emotions that we have will be in complete accordance, in complete harmony with our innate nature. And so, yes, we can have emotions, and we can't do without emotions, but the emotions should arise from and be in harmony with our innate nature. So as an example, if we attend a funeral, we feel sad. If we attend a wedding, we're very happy for the couple. So this is when our emotions are in complete accordance with our innate nature. And those are the emotions that we should have, rather than emotions that relate to our selfish interests. So if we can achieve this inner harmony, where our emotions are in accordance with the innate nature, then that gives rise to an external harmony. So you can see here in this equation, this flowchart, nowhere does it talk about sort of suppressing our emotions. It doesn't say, to regulate ourselves means that we have to suppress our thoughts or our feelings. So, for example, if I get angry now, I can't, lose my temper because I'm talking to you. That would be suppressing my emotions. What it talks about is rather understanding our emotions, understanding their origins, and then being able to really realize them and change them so that we achieve this harmony, not simply through suppression. Now, if we can do that, we achieve an inner harmony, which will then give rise to an external harmony. So internal harmony is steps 1 to 5, or levels 1 to 5, and then the external harmony is related to 6 to 8. So this idea that, external harmony is not achieved by controlling others, manipulating others, threatening them, and they have to agree with us, because if they don't, they lose their job. And so there's this, everyone sort of says yes, but actually inside they really don't agree. So that's not really harmony at all. What we mean by this harmony is that we achieve an internal harmony, and then that affects change in others. That affects or moves them to achieve an internal harmony in themselves, where they actually realize that, through your reasoning, through your actions and examples, that you're also, they should agree with you because that is the right way to go. Now, this internal change in others can be thought of or through the analogy of spring. When spring comes, all the plants grow, flowers bloom, blossom, and that's not because spring forces them, but because the plants have an internal change in themselves such that it comes into equilibrium with the temperature and the weather. So the plants will have an internal change to achieve this harmony. And that's what we mean by this outer harmony, that, it's through our own cultivation that then helps provide an example within our families and then ultimately our community. We have to move people, influence them through our own actions rather than simply through control. And you can see, of course, then it becomes a very natural process. We cultivate ourselves and then the rest takes place, including flow-on effects to the community. So then it states that the center is the great foundation of the world and harmony is the universal path to its realization. Center is really just another word for the innate nature. And you can see, of course, why that would be the great foundation. We said before, the innate nature, the ultimate reality, gives rise to everything. It's sort of like the TV screen. So when you turn on the TV, there's myriad images. You can see people, animals, environment, a beach, or all of the above. But when you turn off that television, it's a blank screen like what we see here in the picture. So the center is the underlying substance or essence of all things. It's a great foundation of everything in this world. Harmony is what we talked about before, this idea of cultivating our inner harmony. And when we can cultivate ourselves, then we can realize this innate nature. We can realize the center. Why does it say that it's a universal path? Well, because no matter where we're born, past, present, or future, everyone has to cultivate to realize their innate nature and to go through this process of inner harmony, outer harmony, etc. And then it says that once we perfect the center and harmony, then heaven and earth are in their proper positions and the myriad things will flourish. So once we realize our innate nature, once we achieve the highest learning through our cultivation of harmony, then we effect changes in the outer environment. Everything around us, as it says here, heaven and earth, will also be influenced to flourish, to fully develop their potential. As we said before, accord with the way. And when we accord with the way, then everything will be working properly. Everyone will flourish, will lead fulfilling lives. That's what it means by the proper positions. As you can see, this all comes about through ourselves by perfecting the center and harmony. Now, just to recap on this opening passage, because there have been different ideas, you can see that there's, in the first statements were very definitional. It's told us about nature, the way, education. And then it talked about where is the way? It's in every moment, in every instant, but it's also everywhere in everything. And then it tells us that it's not only in everything, it's in ourselves, in these emotions that we have. These are also manifestations of the way, if we can accord with these innate virtues. And then it manifests in everything around us, such that we can actually have an effect on the world if we can cultivate. So if we go back to the title now, according to Zhenxuan, Zhongyong, what does it mean? It's a record of the use of the center and harmony. Center is the innate nature. Harmony is this cultivation. Yong then is to use it, to apply it. So Zhongyong means practice of the innate nature, which we've translated as practice of the mean. Now, we said this ultimate reality seems quite abstract, but actually by practicing it, it becomes what we experience. It becomes the experienced reality. And I'd like to use the words of Harvard professor Du Weiming from his book on the Zhongyong, in which he says that the human way is on the one hand deeply rooted in heaven, in this ultimate reality, and yet on the other hand, it's universally manifested in the daily affairs of the world. So the essence of us as human beings is not just something theoretical, but it's an experienced reality. So what began as something quite metaphysical, something philosophical in the first few lines, actually, as we progress through the passage, tells us that it's something that we can achieve in our everyday lives. It's something that we experience on a moment-to-moment basis. There's no moment when we leave the way. Every day we interact with people, whether it's, if you're at school, uni, work, or even online. And it's through these interactions, these daily tasks, that we actually realize the way. We realize the highest potential that we have, our innate nature, and ultimately the ultimate reality. So this first passage of the opening passage of the practice of the mean really inspires us to make the most of every moment that we have and every interaction that we have with others, or the tasks that we do on a daily basis, so that we can achieve our highest potential and also achieve this all-encompassing harmony. So I leave you with that thought. Thank you very much.